An unarmed black man is shot and killed in El Cajon, and protests erupt from an angry community, and they continue as the week goes on. There are questions about accountability, transparency, and how police are trained to deal with mental health issues. I'm Amitha Sharma, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Amitha Sharma, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are Ebony Monet of KPBS News. Welcome, Ebony.
Thanks for having me.
Andrew Bowen of KPBS News. Nice to see you here.
Glad to be here.
And Jean Guerrero, also of KPBS News. Hello, Jean.
Hi, Amitha.
And Tony Perry, our old friend, who's now a freelance reporter and who's covering this story for the Washington Post. Young black men were 9 times more likely than other Americans to be killed by police in 2015, according to a study by the Guardian newspaper. This grim national statistic hit home this week when El Cajon police shot and killed Alfred Olango, an unarmed black man originally from Uganda. Police said Olango was acting erratically, weaving in and out of traffic. El Cajon police released a still photograph taken from a witness video, which showed Olango in what they called a shooting stance, pointing an object at the officers. It turned out to be a 3-inch vape pipe. Today, after protests and mounting pressure, the El Cajon Police Department and District Attorney Bonnie Dumanis agreed to release the complete video of the shooting. And a warning, the video is disturbing. Andrew, what did cell phone and video surveillance show of the police shooting?
Well, so the first thing we see is Alfred Olango, staggering, sort of walking back and forth in the parking lot of a strip mall. Then we see one of the officers with his weapon drawn approaching Olango. You can tell that they're sort of talking. We also hear and can see Olango's sister, who originally called 911 because he was having a psychiatric emergency. We see her sort of behind the first officer. She yells, "Don't shoot him, officer, don't shoot him," and then she yells at Alfred, "Take your hands out," because his hands were in his pockets. An officer also yells, "Take your hands out." A second officer arrives. They both have their weapons pointed at Alfred, and then ultimately you hear the gunshots and he falls to the ground.
At one point, it looks like Olango is backing away from police, and then he's shot.
Well, I think that Alfred, the police is approaching Olango. There's sort of a back and forth that you can tell that Olango is sort of avoiding the police officer. It's very unclear. It's taken from far away, and it's not very high quality. These people basically just kind of look like black smudges. So another thing is their faces are also blurred out. So it's difficult to tell exactly what's going on, whether or not we can actually definitively see, was Alfred Olango in a shooting stance like the police say? I don't think that this video answers that question.
Police say they got multiple calls that day on Tuesday about a man in the middle of the street. They also say a woman identified herself as Olango's sister said that he was not acting like himself and that he was unarmed. Pick it up from there. What happened next?
So the police arrive about 50 minutes after the first call was placed. They say they were responding to other calls, and it really took them that long to actually clear a team to respond to this call. 2 officers arrived. The situation escalated very quickly in 1 or 2 minutes, and the police say that Olango was not following their commands. At one point, they say he reached into his pockets and pulled out an object, like you said, which turned out to be a vaping pen, and he took what they called a shooting stance. And that's when the officers fired their weapons. One officer fired a taser, and the other officer fired a gun, and Olango was pronounced dead at a hospital later on.
Okay, so that's what police say. What do witnesses say?
Well, it's difficult to say. The police obviously have conducted interviews with witnesses on the scene, and that's part of the investigation, which has not yet been made public at this moment. There have been some media interviews with some witnesses or people who say that they saw it. A lot of different information. Some say, some have confirmed that he had his hands in his pockets. Others said that he had his hands up when the police shot him. So it's very difficult to suss out what really happened. The police also said he had a shirt on. Some witnesses said he didn't.
There's been some controversy about what kind of unit was sent out to the scene. Run that down for us.
Yeah, so the city of El Cajon and really all law enforcement agencies in the area have what's called a Psychiatric Emergency Response Team, or PERT. And they are basically uniformed officers paired with a clinician who's specially trained to deal with folks who are having a psychiatric emergency, either mentally ill or having a nervous breakdown, as the family of Olango says is the case on Tuesday. And so El Cajon police say that their perched clinician was on another call. The police are able to call for either the county sheriff or a neighboring jurisdiction to ask if they can send some of their psychiatric clinicians to respond. Obviously, they have to take into account a number of factors, including how long it'll take that person to get there, how urgent the situation is. So, I think there is in this whole story a question of resources. Do the El Cajon police have enough of these clinicians on hand? Does there need to be a streamlined process when one city has their clinician occupied and they need support from other agencies? So there are a lot of questions about the type of response that was called in for this emergency.
And that's an issue that's not likely to go away. Another issue that appears to be resolved, as we announced at the start of the show, was there was a big push to get this video released. Earlier in the week, police did release a still, which seemed to affirm the department's version of what happened, but they didn't want to release the video until today. What was their explanation for doing that?
Well, so this dates back to a policy that was announced a little less than 2 months ago by the county district attorney's office. That policy basically states that videos of officer-involved shootings, which is the technical term for this kind of thing, are considered evidence in the investigation of a potential crime. And the authority to release those videos or to keep them secret rests with the district attorney, because the rationale is basically if the video were released too early on, then that being out in the media and people seeing that could basically bias the potential jury pool if someone were to be charged with a crime.
And I want to seize on that point because the Olango family attorney, Dan Gillian, said yesterday that it appears that the El Cajon Police Department was litigating this case in the public by releasing the still and not the video. If true, that didn't appear to work so far.
No, it didn't. And of course, the explanation of why they released a still was that what District Attorney Bonnie DeMonis says were false narratives about Olango having his hands up. Were starting to circulate social media and such, and so to dispel that, they put out this still to show that indeed it purports that he is a shooting stance, has something metallic in his hand, and then the officer, or one of the officers, who's about 10 feet away, fires his service weapon. Another officer who's a little further away fires a taser. So they made different decisions in that split second.
And I do want to talk about that. So as you said, one officer fires a taser, while another officer fires his gun. How unusual is it for those two actions to occur simultaneously?
A bit unusual, and actually it might be actually a sign of improvement on how to deal with these things. There had been a tendency, I remember one time in San Diego, for everybody to fire. If one person fires, it gets ready to fire, everybody fires. So that was not the case here. Now,
but I always thought that there had to be an escalation of force.
Preferably, but not in that millisecond that a sworn police officer has to make a decision on what to do to protect his life and the lives of other people. And the state law provides enormous latitude for officers to make that decision and use deadly force in a millisecond.
Let's talk about public reaction. Times have changed. The Black Lives Matter movement has made a real difference in how the public reacts to these shootings. Here's Eddie Price, an El Cajon businessman and organizer.
But these feelings that I'm feeling right now are not new. This is not a justice problem. This is past justice. This goes into the morality of humanity. Everybody ought to be conflicted about this. Imagine if this was you. Imagine if this happened to you every day of your life, and you can count like clockwork that somebody is going to get disrespected today just because of the color of their skin.
Ebony, you covered some of the protests. What have they been like? What are people saying?
Well, I think speaking about the Black Lives Matter movement, I think this is really empowering people to speak out. Like the gentleman in that soundbite just mentioned, this is not a new feeling for a lot of people in the community who I've spoken to. However, what I did see was just this immediate reaction from people. Instead of waiting until the following weekend to organize a vigil and march down, there was that immediate reaction the night after the shooting, the night just hours after the fatal shooting occurred. And I'm just hearing people saying different things, like they're frustrated, but a lot of fear, a lot of concern about, could this have happened to them? And if it did happen to them, what would be the consequences? Would anyone care? Would there be any sort of repercussions for the officer if it was, something that they perceive to be unjust?
And I think there are some unique things in this situation here. In particular, there was a Facebook Live video that came out that showed the immediate aftermath, and the woman who called the 911 for her brother. You can hear her basically saying to the police, "I called you for help, and you shot and killed him." At that point, it wasn't clear if he was actually dead, but I think there's certainly a difference of perception between white communities and communities of color. This was a situation in which a black person called the police asking for help to control a situation of a psychiatric emergency, and the end result was that person being shot and killed. And so, there are a lot of details in between and a lot of nuance to this story, but I think for a lot of people who are a part of the Black Lives Matter movement, they see this as really part of that entire narrative of, we ask the police for help, and what we get in response is lethal force, and we need to we shouldn't even be calling the police for help in our communities because we could end up dead.
And the Washington Post, I'm doing a little work for them, has found that that's a very common scenario, that a lot of these calls begin from a family member, that a family member is in distress psychologically, could you come out, and it ends up in a shooting. Very common. So we find out that San Diego really is part of the world and is facing the same problem that is being faced elsewhere. What I thought was interesting in this was that it did show the cumulative impact of Charlotte, Tulsa, Ferguson, New York City, and a whole bunch of others in two ways. One, the anger of people in El Cajon. This is happening everywhere. We had Eddie Price and that very powerful discussion about, I'm 56 years old, I've been black all my life, and I've always been a target. My son is a target. But also, on the other hand, I thought the El Cajon PD, the chief, Jeff Davis, reacted. He knew what was potential here, and he put out a statement. You can quibble with it. He put out a picture. He held a press conference. So both sides, and he said, given what's happening nationally, I thought it was important for us to make a statement that we're going to look at this, not just our eyes, lots of eyes. So we see that San Diego really is a part of the main, and we're reaping the whirlwind, plus and minus, of what's going on in this country right now.
Right. So there's a very familiar ring to this story, both Absolutely. In the story itself and the reaction, but each community is unique. And I do want to talk to you, Ebony, about what some of the community leaders you spoke with said about the relationship between the El Cajon Police Department and the larger community.
Well, specifically, a lot of the faith leaders I spoke to were based in San Diego, but I think it's reflective throughout the country and here in California as well, in San Diego locally, in El Cajon. I think that the relationship between the police department and the black community has been very tense for quite some time, and I think that that's reflected across the country. I would argue probably since forever there's been that distrust there. I think at times it's been better than not. I think that there's a difference when you speak to someone of a younger generation than if you speak to someone who is more of an elder in the community. But I believe there was a Pew study that came out recently, and it was asking the people being surveyed just how often police treat people equally of different ethnicities. And 75% of the respondents who are white said that they believe that police treat people equally. And it was only 30 to 33% for black Americans who responded to that poll. And I think that's reflective, like here locally as well as nationally, just this distrust in this relationship.
And if
problem.
I could jump in really quick. So at the press conference that the police chief held on Tuesday night, I asked if the city of El Cajon has something similar to what exists in the city of San Diego and also with the county sheriff's department of a sort of citizens review board on police practices. Basically, these are people in the community, civilians and they are basically tasked with reviewing what the police are doing, certainly in reviewing incidents of officer-involved shootings. That doesn't exist in El Cajon, and what the chief said is basically we're following state law, and I think that we're doing a pretty good job. I also asked, what is the El Cajon Police Department done, and what does it continue to do to improve relations with people of color? And he wasn't really able to provide me a clear response. He said, you know, we have 2 pastors here from black churches, and you know they're speaking to their constituents, but it's unclear at this point how much El Cajon has actually undertaken to try to repair relations with people of color.
But now the mayor of El Cajon, Bill Wells, tried to speak to this issue a little bit. He held a press conference this week. Here's a clip of what he said.
I saw a man who was distraught, a man who was acting in ways that looked like he was in great pain. And I saw him get gunned down and killed, and it broke my heart. If it was my son, I would be devastated.
Jean, Olango's family says he was not mentally ill, that he was having a mental emergency because he had just lost a childhood friend and he was grief-stricken. Tell me about Alfred Olango. What's known about him?
So we do know he was a refugee. He came here from Gulu, Uganda when he was 12 years old with his family fleeing political persecution. His mom says that he was a really loving father. He loved to cook. He worked as the lead cook in several restaurants in multiple states in the United States.
And he also had some run-ins with the law. What can you tell me about that?
That's correct. He was convicted of transporting and selling drugs. He had a firearms conviction, among other things. Immigration and Customs Enforcement tried to deport him a couple of times because of these criminal convictions. They failed to do so because they contacted the Uganda government for a travel document. That's usually what they have to do when they're deporting somebody from overseas, and they didn't get a response, so they had to release him from detention.
Tony, there's a very, very tragic irony in this. There's an added dimension. Olango was from Uganda. He came here to escape the violence in his country, and yet he loses his life here.
Very tragic, and as Jean points out, he had a very complex criminal and immigration history. What do we make of that? Twice ordered deported, couldn't do it because Uganda wouldn't take him back. He'd served prison time, drugs, firearm possession. He'd also been picked up, some drunk driving, some allegation, also spousal abuse. So he had a mixed history. Now, none of that probably bears on what happened in that millisecond in that parking lot in that strip mall in El Cajon. But you know, if we're looking at who he is, that's who he was. Now, what is interesting, I'm having trouble reconciling his mother's very passionate statement the other day at the very tearful press conference that he wasn't mentally ill, with what his sister supposedly said, both when she called 911 and also then later to the media. I'm having trouble.
So there have been conflicting reports. One was that he wasn't, that she had said he wasn't acting like himself. Another one that she said he was mentally ill.
So what do you make with that? And I don't know that those will ever be squared up at all.
I'd like to jump in also. I think, you know, as long as we're talking about Alfred Olango's troubled past, we could also mention that one of the officers who was identified in this incident, his name is Richard Gonzalez, I believe, and he was actually sued by a fellow police officer. He was a sergeant, and he had reportedly sent her lewd text messages, basically propositioning her for sex with her wife, and also sent her some pictures of his genitals. And so he was ultimately demoted from sergeant to officer, but he was not fired.
He was kept on the force.
Exactly. And so I think that that's sort of a complicating factor here. You know, if we're paying attention to Alfred Olango's past, we also need to pay attention to this police officer.
So what kind of bearing do sexual harassment allegations against a police officer have during an investigation of this officer for a shooting?
I don't know that in terms of the investigation that will end up with Bonnie DeMonis making a decision on criminal charges, I don't know that it bears on that. Mm-hmm. Now, it may bear on the decision that the chief of police will have to make. What about this officer? Do I want this officer on my force any longer? He may not. And he, of course, can look at the full personnel record and what kind of cop has he been for 21 years.
Let's talk about Bonnie DeMonis. She's never prosecuted a police officer for an officer-involved shooting. Why is that? How high is the bar? Oh,
very, very high. Using a different metaphor, it's an 8-lane freeway. The the latitude given to police officers in when and how to react to a life-threatening situation that they perceive. Now, we've had people killed by police officers when they're holding an ink pen or a trowel or a broom or something that the officers believed was a firearm, and that, of course, is the assertion here, that the officer thought it was a firearm, and it turns out to be one of these vaping pens, and that Olango had been ordered, drop your hands, put your hands down, and defied that request. This situation of not charging police officers didn't begin with Bonnie DeMonis. Paul Finks and Ed Miller, her two predecessors, I can only think of one each for each of them, and they lost both of those cases. I can only think of one other one. We're talking National City, Escondido, and San Diego, and I've been here forever. All cases that were brought by the prosecutors, and in every case they were found not guilty. Very difficult to bring a case, and very, very difficult to get a jury of 12 men and women true in San Diego County to convict.
Jean, you were there at the press conference yesterday by the family. What did they say?
So, I mean, the family, one thing that really struck me, I mean, we were talking about the mental health issues, and the mother, she insisted that her son was not mentally ill, but she did, in line with what the sister had said, mention that he was having a breakdown because of his friend. And I mean, I spoke with a researcher, Jamal Muhammad, who's been looking at mental health issues in the East African community here in San Diego, and he's found that the symptoms, if you want to call them that Olango was showing are not uncommon in this community, because many of them have exposure to traumas, whether it's directly because they experienced war in their home countries, or indirectly through a loved one who is suffering severe stress from the memories of it. And also he mentioned that there's police discrimination, that they have a sort of fear of police because they live in these low-income communities where they feel targeted for whatever reason. So he says these things, in combination with the grief of having just lost his friend, it would make perfect sense that he would then have the emotional breakdown.
Of course, none of this could have been known to those officers. All
Right.
they know is they've been sent to a volatile situation of a man acting erratically. They don't know the man. There's no indication that they knew his criminal or immigration history. They get there very quickly, and the shooting happens within a minute. Also very common, when they studied hundreds and hundreds of these cases in San Diego County District Attorney, they found that something like 45% of them happen what they call immediately upon the officer getting there, 65% within 3 minutes.
Very quickly, what kind of training do officers receive in dealing with the mentally ill?
Well, they are taught, how well you can argue, that they need to de-escalate and the use of the voice. On the other hand, police officers do not have the right that you and I have when we see a dangerous situation. We can run and hide. They have to confront that situation in one way or another, so it's a mixed bag. Now, you can argue that they should do more, and I think this is the kind of thing the chief and his bosses, the city manager and the mayor and the council, will have to decide. Are we doing enough? Should we use this as a learning lesson? One thing that Bill Wells, the mayor, did say that struck me was that he was concerned that if it took an hour for the two officers to get there, and then a shooting happens within a minute, but that it took them an hour to get there. Now, they have 120 cops for a city of, what, 104,000, something like that. Is that
is an
enough?
issue that's going to be explored a lot. We do have a clip from the mother from yesterday's press conference. After we hear that, I want you to comment on what she said, Ebony.
I have been seeing all this, praying for all the mothers and fathers that have lost their loved ones, exactly like mine. I prayed that things should be different. Have not seen the good productive. No answer. It keeps going. It keeps going. Now, I didn't know that the next time it will be me.
It's a very moving clip, Ebony.
Very emotional clip, and I think that that's a fear of a lot of mothers out there, just concerned for their children. And when you speak to police arriving at a scene and they have to make that split-second decision, you see on the news, you see someone who's accused of domestic terrorism being taken into custody injured, but on a gurney and alive. And a lot of mothers are asking, how can you take down this person who has actually fired at police, but you cannot, take my son into custody and leave him alive? Is it because you're not valuing his life? And it becomes to the question of, do you not value his life for some reason? And that's the case that I'm hearing over and over from people in the community. They just don't feel as if they're valued, and therefore they feel like their children are in danger, and then they don't have a way to protect their children because, as we've discussed here, oftentimes police are not prosecuted for these shootings. They're usually investigated internally and deemed justifiable, even if there has been video that has been panned by people in the public as being unjustifiable, seemingly. So they feel like there's no recourse, there's no support for them. So a lot of these mothers feel helpless.
Now, some community members are calling for a federal investigation precisely for that reason. San Diego's U.S. Attorney Laura Duffy has said she's watching the situation closely, and if there's a federal civil rights violation, the Justice Department will look at that. What would constitute a civil rights violation in a case like this?
Well, first of all, Bonnie DeMonis, the district attorney, says that she and the FBI will be briefed on Monday by the El Cajon police on their investigation. At some point, a report will come to her, and she and her staff will have to decide. I think, given the history, there's very, very, very little chance that charges will be brought. Now, what decisions the chief will make, that's a whole other issue that we don't know enough about to discuss. I think, and I cannot remember a time when a federal prosecutor has stepped in San Diego County and said, this is so egregious, even though it's been dealt with in state court, we're going to deal with it a second time. That's happened elsewhere. I have not seen that happen here. I'd be surprised if it happened here, particularly given what we know, and we only know a little bit, and the picture, candidly, that's a very dramatic picture. I would be very surprised. It would have to be, it would seem to me, very, very egregious. Comments made by the cops, history of the cops, and we don't know enough about their history to make a decision like that. Very surprised if the U.S. Attorney here made that decision.
And we've got to close it there. That wraps up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. Thank you to Ebony Monet, sorry about that, Andrew, Jean Guerrero, and Tony Perry for joining me. A reminder, all of the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Amitha Sharma. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.